So it's great to connect with you all today. What I want to do is I want to share with you some of our best thinking around the future of partnerships in the industry. And again, whether you're a small organization or big, whether you're a dark horse or a multinational, whether you're an agency, a retailer, or a supplier, the rules are changing and there's a lot going on here. So again, let me just kind of tee this up and take you through this journey. There's a quote that I love that I think really frames this conversation. It's a Mark Twain quote. And the quote is, "It ain't what you know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And I know one thing for sure that just ain't so. Partnerships are no longer peaceful. They're under a lot of duress because of COVID, because of the industry transforming, because of digital transformation, because of hyper competition, because of a lot of factors. The game of partnerships is under pressure. And I think that's the most important thing. When you think about it, partnerships are being tested. Everybody's partnership is being tested. And that's an opportunity, but you really have to keep your eyes open. I actually either spoke with, sat down with, or kind of had a phone conversation with 20 suppliers. It's actually, the number now is up to about 25. I spoke with them about their expectations around partnerships. Many of them smaller, mid-sized, just like you. A handful of them big multinationals. I also spoke with 10 retailers. Many of these retailers, actually all of these retailers are retailers you know. The retailers with a lot of impact in the industry, and the retailers that make a difference in everybody's business. So I've tried to bring together the voice of both sides of the equation. And actually, ironically, yesterday, I was having a conversation with an agency, a broker representation agency, and I talked to them about partnerships. And they were, again, sharing exactly the same challenges that both suppliers and retailers are going through. So the question is, what has changed in partnerships? And there's a lot. So if you go back and you think a little bit, there's been a heck of a lot of dynamic shifts going on in business, in how we relate, and how we create value with each other. And I want to just share a couple. I want to remind you of a couple of very high-profile situations. You know, Borders, when you go back 15 years ago, was spinning off $100 million in profit. 4 years later, they were losing $100 million. Why? They ignored something pretty significant. They ignored a lot of things, but they ignored the digital transformation, the path to purchase of a consumer, the role of acquiring knowledge online and doing business online. They just flat ignored it from a leadership position. Same thing with BlackBerry. In 2009, this business had a 50 market share. 5 years later, it had a 1 market share. Why? Well, their very loyal community got smaller and smaller and smaller. And it got smaller because they ignored a behavioral shift in how people were using these devices. They ignored the role of the internet. But you look back now, it's a mind-blowing dropping of the ball. They just did not want to embrace reality. Let me kind of frame it a little even more personal for all of us. If you go back 65 years, the organizations on the Fortune 500, 10% of them are left on that list. 90% have fallen off. Why? Transformation, blind spots, not wrestling with the truth, not staying relevant, not staying in tune, not rethinking their business. So I think you could hit it with a couple of major frames, and I like to look at it from the perspective of blind spots and biases. They had a confirmation bias, many of these places. What is a confirmation bias? It's the idea that you see what you expect to see. Not what is, what you expect to see. And then you think of it from the perspective of a desirability bias, which is we see what we want to see. Those two filters will get you in trouble. And that was the frame that I brought together some of these interviews to figure out where are our biases in partnerships? Where are the blind spots? And I'm going to hopefully frame this for you today that you can really take very seriously as you think about moving into the future, both retailers and suppliers. So I think think of it as, how do we rethink partnerships? Some things have changed, some things have dramatically changed, but you have to rethink what it is, where the value comes from, and what's getting in the way. There's some Forrester research that talks about sales engagement in a B2B world. And the data says, and I've replicated this probably 10 times over the last 15 years, 85% of all sales calls don't create enough value, according to the buyer. You're either stating things they know already, stating things they don't care about, or not really understanding their business. It's a significant blind spot. But the good news is 3 of 4 B2B buyers will actually change who is the preferred partner if the new partner brings them an insight into a challenge that they're not really thinking through yet. If they help them see the opportunity in the larger category differently and better. So there's always opportunity to break through, but most companies are not as objective as they think they are, and they are suffering from their own blind spots. So I think one of the things we're seeing from a retailer perspective and a supplier perspective are 3 mega pillars that are influencing a lot of things going on with partnerships. One is there are brand new consumer behaviors. Many of them are not formulated yet. They're not fixed yet. They're in flux, but the behaviors are changing. Number 2, there's cost inflation, and we're seeing it in most categories. And 3rd, there's limited face-to-face time, which is causing stress on partnerships. So when you go a little deeper into this, and I think this is really, really fascinating feedback that I've been sharing with my clients and sharing in many of the executive share groups I moderate. 9 in 10, or 92% of B2B buyers prefer a virtual sales call versus face-to-face. And that's up 17 points from last year, which is a significant increase. 9 in 10 prefer we doing business over a screen just like this versus face-to-face. Here, if we go a little deeper, 8 in 10, 79%, or 8 in 10 of B2B buyers believe the virtual call is more effective. And that's up 25 points from last year. So they prefer a digital meeting, and they actually think digital meetings are better. So when I share that with people who are in the world of sales and marketing, they're blown away. They think it's bad data, they don't understand it. But when you go back into the retailer mode and ask the question, what are they getting out of that call that's different? That's an important insight into how to build partnerships moving into the future. You must be better over a screen, and you must be more synthesized. You must bring exactly what people are looking for. You must be engaging, and you must not waste time, because they get more done in this medium, which is why ECRM's business has been flourishing, because this is a great model for how the world has changed. There will be face-to-face meetings, but it's going to be for meetings that actually really truly need to be face-to-face. And that's an insight. Here's an insight for all of us. Anybody who does business with somebody in a room, you overestimate your face-to-face impact. You just overestimate it. The research says that 85% of people think they're extremely self-aware, but the data says it's more like 10 to 15%. So what does that mean? It means we got to be more in tune with how we build relationships, how we do meetings, how these things go down. We have to be extremely relevant and extremely engaging and extremely authentic. So that's a big shift going on that's influencing partnerships. So the question is, well, now what? What do you do with this? And that's where this research is pretty powerful. So I'm going to lay out the suppliers. I'm going to give you some quotes from suppliers on their changing expectations with a partner, a retail partner. And then I'm going to lay out the retailer's expectations, which are changing. And then I'm going to lay out essentially what are the new rules Together, how do we work better together? So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the supplier. This is what suppliers tell me in a very candid environment. They say this: things have changed. Our business has changed with how we do business with retailers and how we think about partnerships. It goes a little deeper. They would say, as a supplier, we have choices now. Years ago, we didn't have choices. All the power was on the retailer side. That's not true anymore. There's mutual power. There's mutual interests, and suppliers have choices. They can build their business with specific retailers. They can build it direct to consumer. They can build it all through Amazon. They can build it all through different unique digital platforms that might really be right for their business. Or they can go to market nationally. But they have choices, and they have smart choices. They also said to me, due to the limited data availability, retailers don't really appreciate the size of Amazon's business with us as a supplier. So what they're saying is, we have choices, the rules have changed, and many retailers we do business with don't really appreciate and even understand the size of this Amazon business, which causes competitive challenges in the marketplace that you have to be very thoughtful about as you're building a business today. Because again, every retailer partnership relationship gives you advantages and also gives you liabilities that you have to be thoughtful about step by step. They go further and they say, this is pertaining to the Amazon relationship. They would say, we're actually stuck in the middle between Amazon and everybody else. And it doesn't matter what we do, we seem to frustrate all the retailers because of the Amazon relationship. And the Amazon relationship obviously is not going away. It's a vital piece of everybody's business that's part of a portfolio. But that is on the mind of a supplier, managing this hierarchy of retailers. They go a little further saying, and we're doubling down on this Amazon partnership. We're trying to be even more profitable with this relationship, but we're doubling down on it because of the power of it and because of the importance of it. A whole other piece of feedback that suppliers were sharing is the following. They would say, additional trade funding discipline is a necessity now, given the ongoing cost escalation across the market. Our discipline with funding, our discipline with investments, our discipline with anything in our business has to be more thoughtful than it's ever been because of the escalation. They would also say that there's pressure to reduce trade investments and increase our digital capabilities. So they're feeling, and this is true of you also if you're a supplier, you are recognizing and feeling the pressure that every trade investment has to pay out because it needs to be redeployed. There are other places to put that strategic resource. And no resource is fixed anymore. Every resource is variable, which means it can be cut, redeployed, and reinvested. And that's a mindset that many of the top suppliers are embracing today. They also go further saying, we critique each retailer's cost to serve. Every single retailer, we critique the cost to serve the consumer. And we must and will improve overall profitability with each retailer. So there was a day when unprofitable retailer relationships, organizations just turned their head and said, that's just how we do business with them. And now we're in a world where it has to be improved and tough decisions have to be made to make sure the relationship is profitable. And that's on a supplier's mind today. Most retailers would not appreciate how intense that debate is away from the calls with them, how important that conversation is. And again, they would say, this means we need to have great financial rigor in everything we do, in every line item. They would also say that supply chain stress and cost increases, they're actually daunting. They're just daunting. And we will improve our retailer return on investment, or we won't continue investing in them. or we will walk away from certain parts of that business because it's not profitable. And I can tell you, in the 35 years I've been in this industry, I've never seen suppliers now be so thoughtful about investments, because post-COVID, there's an opportunity to actually recast your business. And the things that aren't working, you can recast. And it's given people the courage to do that. And again, I think an obvious thing, but maybe it's not that obvious. The quote is, we're placing higher weight on retailers that are growing. Now, I think everybody's done that in the past, but I think now they're looking at this as a true financial portfolio, saying, where are we growing and where is it profitable? And let's determine how we go forward with each of these partners. And that is a real common theme coming through with many, if not all, of the supplier communities. And I think there's a new metric that's been coming up that's really been interesting to listen to suppliers reference and talk about it. And that's the idea that our most important metric is our digital return on advertising investment, not just our trade investment, not our broker agency investment, not conventional marketing development, but what is the return on advertising investment from a digital perspective? Because it's a difficult metric to get to, and they're recognizing this metric has to be right. We have to be analyzing it properly, and we got to be delivering against this metric. So that's on their mind too. And I think just in general, you're seeing suppliers think more, and especially even sales organizations, thinking like portfolio managers. And I can tell you, having been a VP of sales of 2 companies, and there's 50 companies I work with in a group called the Elevation Forum, I'm sitting down with a lot of VP of sales consistently every week. They're all thinking like portfolio managers now. And I don't think that capability was refined a few years ago. So that is a different mindset as they're sitting down with suppliers, as they're sitting down with retailers. It's really important to understand that is the mindset coming from their senior leadership. I thought this was an interesting quote. We think of retailers, this came from a VP of sales, we think of retailers as agencies when they, advertising agencies, when they prove themselves worthy. They're an agency, an arm to build our brands with the consumer when they prove themselves worthy. They also said retailers are no longer just merchants, they're bankers, they're supply chain specialists. And the one CEO of a retailer agency that gave me that quote was actually very frustrated, saying, we're not working with retailers who are merchants anymore. They're bankers, they're financial analysts, they're supply chain specialists. And he was frustrated. And the funny thing is, as we were talking about it within a small group, he came to realize, yeah, they are bankers now. They are supply chain specialists because the world has changed. And they're merchants. So you need to be thinking of this relationship like that. That's their mindset. And that's how they're operating. And that's how they need to be operating. One of the big interesting blind spots that I think came out of the early supplier interviews was suppliers were saying the digital cost increases that retailers are feeling the negative effects of, meaning shipping your product to their door, to a consumer's door, picking the product up, putting it in a basket, walking it out to the curb, putting it in the consumer's car. That incremental cost, they were saying, is not our problem. As I'm watching this conversation evolve, they're recognizing it sure as hell is your problem. It's everybody's problem because the behavior has changed of the consumer. And partnerships need to understand that the behaviors have changed, the costs have increased, and both sides of the table need to figure out how we do this together. So suppliers, I think, are starting to really think differently about that quote and that insight over the last probably 2 to 3 months. Let me lay a couple more on you from the supplier's perspective. I think there's been a lot of change in the industry. I think there's a lot of suppliers saying, I got a big business with fill in the blank retailer, big mass merchants, big national drug chains, big food operators, the dollar industry, the mass market industry. I got big business, and I'm seeing people on the front line I'm working with, the quote was, who lack expertise, lack experience, and they're a little nervous about this. So I think that is on the mind of a supplier too. There's been so much change in this industry. We have to recognize that there's a lot of new blood. There's a lot of people coming into different buying decisions and buying roles and analytical roles that have a lot of intellectual firepower, but they don't have a lot of expertise. And you have to figure out how to manage that and optimize that relationship, because that's not going away. Couple more quotes from suppliers. Since all retailers are transforming, where do we place our bets is always the question. And they believe the retailer must prove their value before we jump into this relationship. And that's a shift versus 3 to 4 years ago. They're now looking at each retailer saying, we need to determine if this relationship is good for us. And that is a significant shift in partnerships, again, from the supplier perspective. And they're following the revenue wherever it leads. I think what's interesting, I spoke to about 50 leaders of sales of a handful of companies that, again, companies you would all know. And they said, I asked, are you 100% forthright in your partnership relationships with your retailers? And they said, hey, on most things, of course, we're a company of integrity. But they said, when I pushed them a bit, and they said, you know what? But there are a lot of things we probably don't say that we should be saying. Meaning 3 and 4 are fearful of always telling the truth in a partnership. And the insight that came back to me was because they're afraid of a relationship blowback from the retailer because of the pressure that partnerships are feeling today. And I think that's very powerful. That's the reality of what's going on in a partnership. But I do know the closer we can get to truth, the deeper the relationship. But it's a sign of the pressure that I think is going on in this dance right now. And the challenge is, if you're a supplier, you got to balance relationship and balance profit. And oh, by the way, that's the challenge if you're a retailer too. So first question I have for you to ponder. Just think about this. And if a question comes out of it, you want to put it in and we can answer it at the end, that's great too. How have your priorities or goals evolved? Whether you're a retailer or a supplier, how have your priorities or goals evolved over the last year? And where are you now in conflict with your partner? Because that conflict is evident to the other side, whether you recognize it or not. That's not a surprise to anybody in the room. What's the conflict? Why is it a conflict? What are you doing to address the conflict? So just think about that. Let's go a little deeper. Let's talk about the retailer. So this is where, again, it's really interesting. There's some interesting research that came out this year. It's from the Retail Industry Leaders Association and also in conjunction with McKinsey. And the research said the #1 industry priority in our industry from a retailer perspective is to become omnipotent with omnichannel. Omnipotent means being godlike, being flawless, being perfect with omnichannel. Because it's not just the future, it's how we do business right now. And if you're behind, if you're not cutting on the edge, you're behind. And every retailer knows that. Or maybe you're really being vulnerable. Another piece of research by the same agency in association with McKinsey was that 2 in 3 retailers believe the growth of omnichannel and digital shopping is their biggest challenge and their biggest opportunity. So 2 in 3 would say that is the #1 priority in our organization, to be just so lined up from a thought leadership perspective and from an execution perspective with aligning with digital shopping and omnichannel capabilities. And actually 100% of retailers believe that personalization is a top 5 priority. So this idea of just truly being more thoughtful than you've ever been before if you're a supplier is where you need to be, because those 3 things are on their mind. And they're on their mind. Every retailer in America, it's on their mind, and it's a top priority. And if you're not aligned around personalization, omni-channel, and digital shopping, you're not creating value on the deepest level in the partnership. So here's another way to think about it. Retailers only charge customers about 80% of the cost of delivering the product, which is unsustainable. I got that quote from one of the top food retailers in America about 6-8 months ago. And they said, every time we walk around our store, filling up that basket, bringing it out to the curb, putting it in the car for our top consumers, we're only covering 80% of the cost of doing that. And they said, it's unsustainable. So we're not in a financial alignment with the needs of the consumer, which is why we have to understand from a supplier perspective how we support that initiative and find a way to get to wholeness from a profitability point of view. The other massive shift is Amazon's ad business is growing at a rate of 70%. And it's spinning off a margin of 75% margin, which is why every retailer is trying to figure out how they play in the world of retail media. And not every retailer's retail media platform is as reputable or doesn't deliver the same results and impact as maybe their competitors. So the point is, you have to really assess where and who is doing retail media well, and how do you experiment with them, and which ones do you not experiment with. And that's a tough decision brand by brand, but that is on the mind of a retailer, and that's a huge revenue stream. It's a strategic advantage if they do it right, and they're experimenting and trying to build that capability, as you all know right now. So are you thinking that way if you're a supplier? And if you're a retailer, do you understand how to effectively bring in your suppliers to make sure that you're conveying the necessity on this and the opportunity? So there's a mindset shift with retailers. And here's a quote from a vice president of merchandising that I thought framed it beautifully. She said, our vision as a retailer hasn't changed. Our job descriptions have changed. And we've evolved to cover the whole omni-channel responsibility. She went a little deeper. She said, there is an immense pressure to deliver on an omni-channel budget. And she developed it for me. She said, Dan, you have no idea how often this topic is brought up and the pressure and the weight of the importance of this objective in our organization. And this is a retailer all of you would love to do business with. The point is, omni-channel is on their mind every day. So winning digitally, winning in store, having one voice, making sure you're connecting on both sides of the equation and operating with oneness, not thinking of this as 2 different parts of your business, but as thinking of it as oneness. They also said, all of the work the consumer used to do to carry, or the weight that the consumer used to carry, is now supported by us as a retailer. As an example, as I said, walking around, filling up a basket, bringing it to the curb, or walking around, grabbing the product, and then finding a way to deliver it quickly. That cost is on their back. And as we talked about, that's an unsustainable piece, and that is driving the difficulty in partnerships and the difficulty with financial conversations. The dramatic increase in costs associated with curbside pickup has got to be offset by our partners, one VP of merchandising said. It's not an opportunity, it's a necessity. They also said, we have set clearer definitions of our success, of what success is for online sales, for online penetration, and for online growth. They're very crisp on their definitions of success, which is why, from a supplier perspective, do you know what those metrics are? Do you know how they're measuring it? Do you understand how important that is to their business, which essentially means your business? They also said retailers are now being evaluated on the effectiveness of shopper segmentation, product availability, which is in stocks, as we all know, consumer views online, consumer impressions online, and consumer acquisition online. So when you look at that, and again, that's a VP of merchandising saying, that's how we're thinking, that's how we're being measured. That's a digital marketer of 3 or 4 years ago. No, actually, that's a category manager today. That's how they're thinking about the dynamics of their business. And we have to allow both parties have to align and understand each other. So I think it's a critical insight to know how they're thinking and where their agenda is. And kind of building on that one voice perspective, one senior director of innovation from a retailer said to me, suppliers must bring together retail and digital as one voice. So there can't just be a digital leader in your company and a sales director managing an operation. They're one. They probably don't have, probably not one human being doing that, but they're literally a hand in a glove. They're hopefully in meetings together, they're planning together, they're thinking together, and at times they're at the same call together, serving different purposes in the call together. That's the future. And that's the future of partnerships. And I think there's another move going on in the retailer community that I think is very important. I'm going to call it the Target effect. Target is one of the very, very best at thinking about their partnerships from a blended vendor contribution. You look at all the revenue streams, all the profit streams, and they have a scorecard to say, here's how you're doing as a blended contributor to our overall business. Gross profit, gross margin, all the key pieces, it's blended. It's one big portfolio. And I'm hoping that that's an evolution. I'm seeing more of that. But when that happens, when you have a blended scorecard, it's very easy to know where you're at, where you're suffering, and you can have more strategic conversations as a partner because you're all talking about all of the investments into one scorecard. And I would encourage suppliers to figure out how you bring that scorecard. If your retail partner is not doing that you bring that to the table. And I would certainly recommend that retailers get to a blended vendor contribution. There's a lot of reasons why I understand retailers don't, but you never get to the strategic conversations on the truest, most holistic level until you do that. So that was an interesting insight. A couple of other insights from retailers I thought was really important. I'm going to call it elevated metrics. And the elevated metrics that retailers are looking for are channel leakage, category leakage, competitive share leakage, international best practices, what's going on digitally that they're not doing digitally from a best practice perspective. So there are elevated metrics around best in class and around leakage and around having a more general management perspective, either on your category or on the aisle, a bigger perspective, a more holistic perspective. And again, I think retailers are coming out of COVID, many of them are realizing there are core consumers and shoppers where the lifetime value is off the charts with certain consumers. And how do we build a moat around them? How do we go deeper with the core? And how do we understand the value of them? I think the more the conversation is built around that conversation, the more both parties will be served. But that's an evolution in how retailers are thinking about their business too. Many of the top retailers, they're rededicating themselves to their communities. They're thinking about big meetings, joint business planning meetings, as not just brand planning meetings, but category vision meetings, which is important for both sides to recognize. How do we think of it truly as a category vision meeting, not just a brand planning meeting? It's a wider spectrum. And again, that's how top retailers are thinking about it. And a challenge that came through with some of the research, I thought was a very powerful point. One key retailer said, how do we maintain supply even during a crisis? Let's do that work now. So for new businesses getting into, being listed with a retailer, how do you have a conversation early on saying, we've already thought through if there's another moment that hits us. Here's how we 10x our inventory quickly. This is our plan to meet demand during a crisis. It's an interesting advantage if you can get your organization thinking about that. And as my friend Wayne shared with me, because he sits down with a whole lot of retailers, and so do I, he reminded me once again, what's on the mind of a retailer? Diverse, inclusive partners. They want organizations who look like America, who look like their shopper, who are thinking diverse and are making this vital and important to the game plan together. And that's absolutely on the best retailers in America's mind today. And we have some work to do. We have some work to do on both sides of the table. Couple of more quotes. Our supplier partnership expectations have increased. So the retailer's saying, our expectations have increased. And they'll say, what's around the second curve? What's around the first curve I can't see? What am I not seeing clearly? What's around the second curve? So thinking as a strategist is really important if you're a supplier, because retailers are saying, help me see things I can't see. Be that kind of a partner and you'll be valuable. International trends. What's going on in terms of transformational retail? That's on the mind of a retailer. They're looking to recast how they do business. They're open to reassess. They're also saying we're chasing the consumer and the consumer is in charge. That's a quote from a retailer. And they're looking for inclusive brands. So we need to have inclusive brands that meet their needs and connect with them heart and soul. The last quote I thought was very powerful. They said, we're overanalyzing everything. And they were saying it's a stress. We're overanalyzing everything. It's exhausting because we don't want to make risky decisions. We don't want to do things that are risky. We got to get some things right. So the more you can get it right when you're working with a retailer, the more you're giving them tools to help them minimize risk, minimize threats. So I think here's the shift. So we've talked about the supplier, we've talked about the retailer. What's the shift going on? And what do you do with it? What is essentially the new rules? We used to be in the age of brands 20, 25 years ago. Then we were in the age of the retailer. Now we're in the age of knowledge, the age of creatives. So being a creative firm that's agile and flexible and can pivot and has ideas, whether you're big or small, you can make a big impact. You can make a huge impact. So what are the needs? What do elite partners do? Whether you're a supplier or whether you're a retailer. Well, I think the best create traffic. They actually define categories. If you're a supplier, you define the category and you drive a trip. You do something to force a human being, to woo a human being to either walk into a store or buy something online. You're defining a category. You're helping us think about a category differently. Number two, you're big on conversion. So you're whatever you do, you're expanding the market basket. You're not trading sales, you're expanding the basket. Everything you do is about expansion of the basket. Thirdly, if you're an elite partner, you're holistic. You're understanding what's around the corner, what's around the second corner, where are the threats, what are growth ideas. And fourth, you think about the future. You're thinking about what's next. That's what elite partners do on both sides of the table. But I think the quote that I think is really important, and this is on both sides of the table, I think this is important for everybody to think about. The quote is, if you don't care about their agenda, they won't care about your agenda. So if you're a supplier, you must understand the agenda of your retail partner. And I would say the mindset shift for retailers today is you must deeply understand the stated agenda and the hidden agenda of suppliers you're working with. They're not always stating all of their agendas, but you've got to be in alignment with their agenda to get more of their resources, more of their emotion, and more alignment. So let's go a little further. Here's a question for you to ponder again. Question would be, how have your partner's metrics, priorities, and goals evolved? And where are you in conflict? So if you are a retailer, where have your supplier partners' metrics, goals evolved? Where are you in conflict? So one other thought to keep in mind when you're thinking about partnerships, it's around this idea of intangible assets. Elite partnerships make their intangible assets tangible. What's an intangible asset? Think of it this way. If you were to look at the Fortune 500, the estimate that is 84% of the value of the Fortune 500 is intangible assets. What is that? It's patents, brand names, exclusive intellectual property, technological advances, specialization that allows you to go deeper into your business, exclusive opportunities, the ability to create experiences with your partners, your community of followers. There's so much intangibleness that I think we have to figure out how we harness it, going both ways. That's how you go into that's how you create deeper partnerships. And I think it's validated with an interesting piece of research that says that the sales experience is 50% of brand loyalty. Experience is an intangible asset. So how do we harness the intangibles in our partnerships to get more out of this thing for each other? Not just the brands, not just pricing, the intangibles. The best partnerships tap intangibles consistently. So the question for you now is, what intangible assets beyond your brands do you possess that would elevate your status in the eyes of either the retailer and vice versa? What intangible assets do you have as a retailer that would elevate your status in the eyes of the supplier? Because you're both selling both ways these days. That's a shift that I think I want to keep reminding you. That's a shift. Both parties are selling more than ever before and trying to meet the needs of each other to figure out how you create more value with each other. So that's a question to ponder. So partnerships, what are the new rules? I just want to lay a few slides out as new rules. I think we got to get to a place where the silos in both of our operations, retailer and supplier, they got to fall. They got to fall. We got to be able to move quicker. We have to have more independence. We have to be able to get things done around the problem quicker. And there's way too much silo management that's keeping relationships at bay. And I see this with small players and big players. It's not just about size. I think there has to be a mindset shift. By that, I would say we got to be really good at embracing fast learning. You know, when coming to an event like this week with ECRM, there's tons of knowledge here. Fast learning. Not holding on to ideas that you think are right when you're finding it may not be right. So we have to be learners. We have to be really students of this industry more than ever before. There need to be setting up time each day to study. It's almost like you're doing homework. It's that important. We got to think about deeper enterprise relationships. And by that, I mean, when a supplier is calling on a retailer, that's the first portion of the relationship. But it's essentially an enterprise relationship. It's sales and marketing and operations and insights on the supplier side, connecting with the retailer from a merchandising and advertising perspective, a supply chain. There's a deeper relationship, and higher levels with both sides need to build relationships with each other. and you have less time to do it, so you have to be smarter with how you do it. But we have to develop stronger enterprise relationships, not just individual relationships. We got to have courageous conversations. We got to be willing to have tough talks. You got to do it well, which means you got to share bad news quicker. Every retailer in the world told me that over the last 10 years. I've done that research. And I'm also seeing it on the manufacturer side. They're saying, we got bad news. If you're a retailer, you got to tell me. If I'm not going onto the shelf, you got to let me know earlier. We have an issue with price. You got to let me know now. You can't just call me the next day and say, let's fix it tomorrow. Bad news has got to move quicker on both sides. One retailer hit it beautifully. He said, I must know of a problem the second you uncover it. Every second matters. And I think that goes both ways. It goes both ways. And I think it's an important shift. Both parties have to be good at co-creation, which means you work together around ideas, not knowing where you're going to land with the idea, but you're creating something together. Could be merchandising, could be a product, but it's a skill of truly creating together. And it's not an opportunity, it's a necessity. More candor, more openness, and more commitment to co-creation. We don't need ruthless honesty where people are being ruthless to each other. We do need more candor. We got to be telling the truth quicker and having difficult conversations. And both parties must have an equal voice in the design of the business plan. This is truly a partnership, which means how are we together creating the plan? And I think the criticism I often hear from suppliers is they say, I'm not creating the plan, I'm given the plan from the retailer. The future is we will create the plan, truly create the plan together. And we have to commit to some kind of a cadence. It may be done digitally, but we got to be able to reassess what we've agreed to and maybe pivot and change the plan based on new knowledge and based on new opportunities, which means the P&L needs to be critiqued. The investments need to be critiqued throughout the year. Even though we've committed to something, we have to evolve to a place where we may have to restate our budget, restate our investments based on new knowledge. And that will be a shift. A couple of other thoughts, and I mentioned this earlier today. Resources are dynamic now, meaning not everything is a fixed investment. Things are variable. You may do something this year, and it's not a sacred cow, we're going to do it next year. So resources are dynamic. We need to redistribute to seize opportunities with where it's the best investment. So that means we have to be more cooperative with our negotiations. The biggest level of tension I hear from a supplier is they don't like the negotiations. They're transactional. They're not strategic. That's going to have to change because, again, suppliers do have choices. And I think we have to learn to be more cooperative with our negotiating on both sides. And proactive funding discussions must go on justifying. So if a supplier has if a retailer has a financial ask, the acumen has to get better to be able to justify why this incremental investment makes sense, why it serves both parties. And I think that's going to be an evolution in terms of new rules and partnerships. There was a senior buyer out west that said, every time you sit down together, if you're a supplier, you should walk into the office and the retailer in their mind should be thinking, I want you to share information I couldn't possibly know. That needs to be the blueprint moving into the future. We discuss things that both sides don't know. We don't just keep restating the obvious and restating facts that everybody already knows. We have less time together. We got to get more out of it together. You have to be more disciplined than ever before, which means you got to be more transparent. You got to take off your mask. You got to be a real human being. You got to be more vulnerable in the moment. You got to be more prepared than you've ever been. And you got to have what I'm going to call a hypothesis experimentation mindset. Meaning when we do business together, we're actually doing experiments. because we don't know oftentimes what's going to happen when we do trade promotion, when we do different forms of media. We all have to be more comfortable experimenting with each other. So the last question I have for you is, what can you do differently to respond to the stress both parties are experiencing? Because there's been a lot stated today. I'm hoping there's one or two things that hit you. What can you do differently? Because there is stress in the partnership. How do you be part of the solution to reduce stress and to really get more out of this partnership together? And I'm going to let it sit right there. And Wayne, if you want to jump back in, if there's any questions, I'm open if we have a couple questions.
Yeah, Dan, that's great. Dan, we have 7 minutes left, and in true ECRM style, we'll cut off. But I do want to thank you for the conversation, the insights, and always deliver some very higher level thought process in terms of what is taking place here in the retail environment, and really taking a step back to think about some of these bigger questions, right, to help you succeed in the retail marketplace. I appreciate the reference to the virtual engagement. I did not pay you for that, so thank you for that. I may call you back for some clarity on some things, but we'll certainly connect again. So Dan, here's a question that seems to be getting some support to ask. And again, we have 7 minutes. I hear that retailers want suppliers to invest more, but suppliers are dealing with increased costs in our supply chain and increases in shipping costs. How do suppliers also absorb additional costs to support retailers? Are retailers willing to raise their prices so suppliers can also remain profitable?
It's the question, right? I mean, that's the question every single supplier is going through right now. So I don't have a clean answer, but I will tell you, I think it's rooted in behaviors, courageous conversations, impeccable planning. When you sit down with facts to talk about your P&L, it's rooted in transparency. You share with your retail partner the full P&L. You tell them, you show them the P&L. And I think the point is you then begin the dance to say, this is not working. Here's where it is working. Here's where it's not working. And you then co-create. So it's transparency, it's co-creation, it's impeccable planning, it's being vulnerable, it's being courageous. And then you go deeper into and then you test the relationship. That's where you test the relationship. Where are we at?
Dan, it's interesting the word you didn't say is transactional.
No, it's not transactional.
Dan, here's another question. Because lowering the cost of a product is not always feasible, what are some of the other things a supplier could do to help the retailer deal with the cost of getting the product to their customer?
Oof. You're talking about like the last mile, or just, well, I think again, I go back to, again, if I understand that question properly, Wayne, I think we normally think of P&Ls as there's fixed assets and there's variable assets. I think the P&L now, everything's variable. So if we're trying to build a profitable relationship with our retail partner, everything is open for discussion in terms of how do we get there, and then where you have your wish list, they have their wish list. You know, you've got your Christmas list, I've got my Christmas list. We have to come together to figure out what do we trade to get there. And it's rooted in, again, a relationship, and it's rooted in being able to say, if we can't figure this out, then we can't figure it out. And I think that's where we're getting with some places are saying we're willing to walk away from that part of the business because we can't justify it. And then we see if the consumer pushes the product back to the shelf. You know, if your brand is strong enough, the consumer will tell you, I want it back on the shelf. But I think those are some of the thoughts that hit me, Wayne.
Yep. And according to Kevin O'Leary today, brand does matter. A lot of opportunity in bringing a brand to market. Lots of channels, lots of opportunities. It's certainly a matrix of opportunity.
Yeah.
Dan, we have 4 minutes left. And what I would like you to do is just take a moment to not selfishly plug, but to just try to provide some insight about the Elevation Forum, because I am intrigued by the higher thought that you bring today, and maybe just an opportunity, a competitive advantage right? For these suppliers to lean into the Elevation Forum and what that's all about, and why I think coming off of this conversation, why it's important for them to know. And you've
Thanks.
got 2 minutes, Dan. Just if you could share a little bit about the forum and what you do.
Yep, I'll nail it quick. So again, I'm a coach, I'm a strategist, I'm a researcher, and I try to serve as a consigliere to leaders of sales, leaders of companies. I do it three ways. I either do it in a group called the Elevation Forum, which you've been a part of for many, many years. We meet 3 to 4 times a year. We meet for 5-6 hours. We talk about 2 or 3 major topics that have to do with your company, your business, your positioning, your strategy. We bring in major retailers to talk about how you be more impactful with them. And these are people that really actually are invaluable to building your business. And you learn from peers, and I facilitate conversations around that. The second thing I do is there's 5 different groups that I lead. We meet once a month digitally, 10 to 12 people. We talk about the industry. We talk about leadership development, customer development, problems in the industry. And it's a really intimate shared group where you learn from other people about, how do you work through the challenges in this industry? From how do you raise price today, to how do you do a go-to-market strategy, to how do you develop the next generation of talent. And then I do a lot of one-on-one coaching, where I do a lot of training, one-on-one, and I facilitate conversations within companies so I can work more intimately with companies. But I would say anybody who is a real learner and that is always looking for an edge from personal development, it's an amazing group of people where I learn from every time I'm in. So they're teaching me as much as I'm a curator, trying to bring ideas together, questions together, and have the group teach each other. So that's kind of what we do.
Dan, that's great. On behalf of ECRM and RangeMe, and we really do want to thank you for your wisdom and thought leadership and inspiration in terms of how suppliers and retailers can win collaboratively, co-creating the business and opportunities of the future. We appreciate your time always, Dan. It's a pleasure